Welcome to Podcast Like It's the 2000s, the podcast where we talk about the films of the aughts here from our perch in 2024. I am one of your hosts, Phyllis Gove.
I'm your other host, Emily St. James. And a fun fact about me is that you can win my heart by reading me poetry, but only like super goth poetry about death. Honestly, that's kind of true.
I think it is pretty true, actually. With us today to continue our mini-series on the top 10 box office is critic and co-author of Back to the Island, the complete critical companion of the Jesus Christ, Back to the Island, the complete critical companion of the classic TV series, with our illustrious host, Emily St. James, of course, is Noel Murray. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about Spider-Man 2.
I'm excited to be here. I mean, just any opportunity to rewatch what I think might be the best superhero movie. We can get into that later on, but
we will. Yes,
it's certainly looking at it again, there's a strong case to be made.
Yeah. Did you obviously saw this back in 2004? I'm assuming.
Yes, I am very old. Very old.
Well, we're all old here. I think we all saw this in the theater back in 2004. Mm-hmm. It does feel like, I mean, we've sort of talked about this a little bit just in terms of the chronology of the movies that we've talked about. We talked about The Dark Knight, which was number 2 on this box office list. So like it's out of chronological order, but it does feel like this was, I mean, would you say, Emily and Noel, that this is kind of different to the Batman sequels in the sense that it very much feels of a piece, like they are really a continued story in a way that I don't know any of the comic book movies had done up until that point.
It does really bridge the gap between what Donner did with Superman, Donner / Lester,
right,
and what Burton did with Batman / Schumacher. God, so it's such a wild time. And but also what the MCU did, where you had to watch 25 movies to make sense of something.
Right.
It's very much like this is a continuing story, but also if you just sit down to watch Spider-Man 2, it gives you all the information you need to make sense of it in a way that is like really satisfying. Like you could come cold to this movie. I was texting a little bit with my sister, and she had not seen Spider-Man 1 when she saw Spider-Man 2, and she was like, I still loved it. So, yeah, you can just kind of come in.
And specifically, the credits are also filling you in.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I would say not enough to where if you hadn't seen the first movie, you would know from watching the credits what happened. But certainly, if you had seen the first movie, it was a nice little reminder of the events. Plus, I want to add, as a comic book nerd, a little Alex Rossi illustrations, adding a certain level of grandeur to it and nodding to comic book fans.
Yeah, it's interesting because we have talked Spider-Man 1 earlier in this miniseries with Esther Zuckerman.
This is the only franchise with 2 entries in the top 10, which is kind of wild when you consider that like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, which just has none, and Transformers and all these big franchises of the era.
I mean, and The Dark Knight and Pirates, like it's all there. It's interesting that these are the only 2 entries, but I do feel like this movie has this sort of it's elevated. I would argue it's better than the first one. It's building off of the strengths of the first one in a way that I feel like very few franchise entries actually do, right? Like most sequels actually just go bigger and noisier and kind of just like double everything. This doesn't do that. That's what they wait for the third one to do that.
I do think, though, I will say, I do think that quite frequently in the superhero realm, especially, that the second film is kind of where they can maybe more do what they wanted to do. Like, I feel like Batman Returns, for example, is more Tim Burton-y than Batman. You mentioned Superman 2 earlier. I think it's, it's got a little bit more of that Silver Age zing to it. This film, of course, even in some science fiction things, I think, the second Star Wars movie, the second Star Trek movie, I don't know what the reason for that is. Maybe it's because once you establish the premise and the characters, you can get more into what you're interested in. But I definitely think that this movie in particular, the first film is fairly Sam Raimi-y. But I do think that this film, Sam Raimi lets himself, I mean, he's almost remaking Darkman as much as he's remaking or doing the second Spider-Man movie.
Totally.
It's like I think some of it is you get the cachet to just like do whatever. Like Hollywood, especially at this time, was skeptical of these sorts of movies. And so when one hit, they would be like, I guess this person knows what they're doing,
Sure.
in a way that is not as true now. Now it's like, well, I guess this enormous machine knows what they're doing. Outside of like James Gunn and Joss Whedon and Ryan Coogler all kind of got a chance to do what they really wanted to with their second films, and you could argue about how good those were. But like outside of that, it's been very much the machine is doing the thing.
Well, the franchise machine that you're kind of referring to is it's so unwieldy now, like it's so gargantuan that and Marvel is to blame in a lot of ways for this, just because the MCU worked as well as it did or was so successful. Everyone was chasing that, and then they realized this is kind of an unchaseable thing. And even, they're even Marvel's struggling right now.
It's always really telling to me that the only other one that worked was the Conjuring universe, which is an accidental universe. And like all the movies, they're kind of related, but not really. It's just like, here's a scary movie about a doll. And you're like, okay. And it's like, it's got all these other movies you can watch, but it's like it's the opposite approach of the Marvel model.
What I would also say too, like, obviously Nolan kind of broke everybody's brains for a while there, just in terms of like what was possible. But it was also like one franchise. It's one thing if you want to do a whole it's the fact that all of these intermingling franchises, when it just feels like I don't know how to feel about any of them anymore. I've kind of started tapping out actually when it comes to the Marvel stuff, because it's just not as satisfying anymore for, I'm sure, a myriad of reasons. But what's interesting about this film to me, when we talked about it on our Spider-Man episode, that was supposed to have Green Goblin and Doc Ock, right? Like, and it was Raimi who was sort of like stripped out Doc Ock and was like, let's just keep this to one villain. And this movie is so much stronger for also just keeping it to one villain, right? Like, it gives you the real estate and the breathing room to allow for not just a great central relationship between hero and villain, but also to give other people and other supporting characters storylines as well. I mean, it's obviously not to just keep kicking Spider-Man 3, but I do think that
a great film that everyone likes.
You do sense studio involvement at that point, right? Like, it does feel like they kind of let him do what he wanted to do with this movie, and then started fucking with the metrics.
There's as much as I do enjoy Spider-Man 3, there's definitely a version of that film that is just Thomas Hayden Church as the villain that works a lot better. And you get that. The thing about that I like about that movie is you can lift all the stuff out that doesn't work pretty neat. Well, yeah,
I would also argue as well, watching this movie, I thought to myself, there's a version of Spider-Man 3 that is actually a little closer to a Dark Knight Rises situation, where it's primarily Harry and you're just going with the sort of new Green Goblin villain, and you're tying yourself back to the first one. Now, admittedly, they wouldn't let him do that because, new villains, blah, blah, blah. Right. But like, even if it was just Venom and Green Goblin, it's just, I actually think that Sandman is the thing that kind of fucks that movie up, quite honestly.
I mean, my theory as to why, these movies tend to get bloated in that way, I guess it's because, you have something, you have a successful franchise, as you know, and what's the reason why you're going to make another one besides making a lot of money? It's like you want to make it on a grand scale. And the MCU, of course, did that, kept topping it and topping it and topping it until ultimately it was essentially, half the universe dying and the end of the world. I mean, really weight, so big that they haven't been able to figure out what they're going to do next beyond this multiverse thing that they can't quite figure out how they're going to make it work. And whereas Spider-Man 2 is really just, the issues in Spider-Man 2 is not, I mean, it's saving the world a little bit because there's this mad scientist who has a very dangerous device, but it's really more about Spider-Man, right? It's more about like, can he balance having a personal life with being a superhero? And the movie, I think, goes through a very interesting progression to get to an ending that is like kind of surprising and also moving and satisfying. And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but
Yeah.
I think the reason it works so well is because it is just, it's like you say, small. It's one villain, it's one idea, kind of being carried through from beginning to end, and it's not on a grand scale. It's on a much more small personal scale.
The explicitly stated stakes of the end of Spider-Man 1 are this tram car of people might die. The
Mhm.
explicitly stated stakes of the end of Spider-Man 2 are Lower Manhattan might die. And like it's an escalation, but it is not a huge escalation. It's like we're going from maybe 100 people to maybe a couple 100,000, which is quite a bit, but also is not like the world-shattering thing that we're used to now.
Yeah, and totally. I also just think that this movie doesn't feel set piecey in
Mhm.
the way that it could as well. Obviously there are set pieces. Everyone remembers the train sequence, but I do think that it still feels pretty grounded and terrestrial, and is still very sort of character forward in a way that makes it not feel so what we've now become, just longing for, I guess, which is these giant set pieces. It just all feels of a piece in a way that is just really organic and classical,
I
that I think
think
makes it
like
work too.
a movie I often think about in relation to this one is 2006's Superman Returns, which was directed by an AI. AI
Yeah,
was advanced that
there was
far
not
at
a
that point.
person behind
There was
that.
not a person
It
behind that
also
film.
co-starred an AI too, which
It
is
did really,
interesting.
yeah. There was an AI involved in that.
Yeah.
But that film has a big set piece, but it ends Act One, and then like it has nowhere to go.
Nowhere
And
to
this
go.
movie, and like I love Superman Returns. I have a huge soft spot for that film. But this movie saves its one big set piece for the top of Act Three, which is so smart. And then the rest of the movie can be charactery because if you've seen the trailer, there's a train thing coming, and
Yeah.
like that's what really makes this film work in a weird way.
I was thinking about while watching, I was thinking to myself, trying to put myself back in 2004. Like
Mhm.
obviously this movie was a huge success and was hailed by critics at the time, including myself. But watching it now, like I almost wondered how would it play today if we were to release
Yeah.
that film now? Like, would people feel? And I don't want to be this sort of like, oh, we used to have more patience. I think probably people are fine. They'd be fine with it. But watching it, it was noticeable to me that like there was not there's action in the first hour, but there's really more comedy and more pathos, in the first hour than there is like, cars smashing through coffee shop windows, that kind of stuff.
An, an interesting modern comparison point might be Guardians of the Galaxy 2, which is similarly like we're going to have a big thing at the end, but the most of the movie has tiny villainy incursions like Spider-Man 2, but is about
Sure.
characters working through their issues and stuff. I find that movie tremendously satisfying. I much prefer it to the first Guardians, but like that's a minority opinion. Most people are like, that's
People are coming around on that one though. I feel it does feel
as
like
always, I'm right ahead of my time.
Emily's right, and everyone needs to get on board. But I do think that excuse me, I do think that Guardians does have um the world is so extraordinary to
Sure.
kind of look at, that I think that gives you a fair amount of leeway in terms of being able to like, whereas this is but this is Peter and Mary Jane and they're walking around New York, quote unquote New York. I do think that I agree with you on the patience thing, Noel, that like we've lost some of that. And it does feel like perhaps we need to get back there a little bit, like that things have become a little too bombastic and things have become a little too crazy. I mean, take for instance the last Spider-Man movie that brings the villains back from
Mhm.
this, and some of the characters back from this franchise, which I enjoyed, and I actually rewatched it relatively recently and was like, this scratches all the nostalgia itches, but it's also so overstuffed and has like so much kind of whiz bang going on in it that it does feel a little exhausting.
I
I
mean,
feel like, go ahead.
yeah, I will say that, this movie is just a little over 2 hours, like about 2 hours, 10 minutes, adding the closing credits. And it doesn't feel long, but it does feel full. like by the time you get to the end of it, the final act, you really do feel like you've watched something, that there's been a lot going on. And it really, I think, is because they spend the first hour on all of these small little personal moments, that they find room for all these little side characters and give them their little. I mean, you really do feel like you've been immersed in this world for an hour before the action really kicks in. And maybe, I don't know. I mean, I guess some of these other movies, the more recent, Marvel films, they do have. I mean, they have maybe really a surfeit of kooky little characters. I think it's become kind of. I think people maybe even drawn that from the Sam Raimi model, where every character is a little bit, eccentric and funny and all that kind of stuff. But it just doesn't feel the same. It doesn't feel quite as natural. Well, satisfying, but natural is the kind of thing I would say. I find frequently, like you mentioned, Phil, that you don't really, you kind of checked out a lot of these movies. I oftentimes these days don't really catch up with them until they show up on cable, where I'll just pop it on, and I frequently find after 30 minutes I realize I just do not care.
Yeah.
And I do feel the formula kicking in. I feel here's the heroes, like Shang-Chi, the Seven Rings.
Yep.
It's okay, but I watched the first hour of it, and it's like, well, here's the best friend character who's a little kooky, and here's this character who's a little kooky, and I kind of felt like, I don't know, like they were trying too hard to keep me entertained until they got to the story.
I think we're entering, like, it looks like Deadpool versus Wolverine is gonna, and Wolverine, I don't remember what it's called, is gonna do like very well. And I think some of that is A, it's the only superhero movie this year, and B, Deadpool is like kind of off to the side. It's very similar to Spider-Man. I don't like the Deadpool movies, but they have a similar escalation of character versus world stakes, and like it will be interesting to see how that gets incorporated into like Kevin Feige's overall vision for the MCU. But I think when that movie's a hit, they're going to take all the wrong lessons from that. When like the real lesson is like, sure, this is a character that's just like doing his own thing, and people like that they don't have to get caught up on 10 million things to understand it.
Yeah, I don't excuse me. I don't think Deadpool per se is going to get folded into the MCU at large, just because his character is such a, I think, honestly, just an outlier. And I don't know if you know this, Emily, but he knows he's in a movie.
Well, I know I'm in a podcast, so it's okay.
So I think that works for Feige in its own little bubble. I don't think he's going to want that character sort of poisoning the well of the grander plan. I could be wrong. I think the Wolverine stuff, I mean, obviously they want to do X-Men. That's happening soon-ish. Who knows? But the thing that I was thinking about watching this as well, and to both your points, but Noel, you talked about the formula, right?
Yeah.
And how the MCU has become ultimately the most expensive television show ever made, yes, right? Like they're very sort of procedural in their own ways. They're very formulaic in their own ways. And that sort of weird muddiness that exists now between television and movies, which I think doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing, but I think it's kind of a bad thing right now, does sort of feel like it's why I kind of love this movie. It's one of the reasons why I love this movie, is that yes, it's an installment, and yes, it's a continuing adventure, but it feels like its own animal. We talked at the top about how it feels like it stands on its own and it can kind of be that thing. So few of these movies now, comic book movies, franchise movies, can stand on their own.
Yeah, I actually wrote about this for the late lamented website The Dissolve about 10, 12 years ago.
R.I.P.
Yes, R.I.P. About the idea of, and this was not, and I wrote about it not as a negative, that the Marvel movies played like a TV show, like they were constantly being shown on Stars and on FX. You could pop it on almost any time of day, and there would be the end of one Marvel movie rolling into another Marvel movie. And I frequently would just pop in and watch pieces of them because they're very well made, very entertaining. It's just like rewatching an old episode of, for me, Perry Mason or Murder, She Wrote, or all those comfort shows that I, return to again and again, even though I've seen the episodes so many times. But this film, I think, has a similar vibe without necessarily, like we said, you don't necessarily need to have seen the previous film to have enjoyed this film, but it does feel like you're entering a world that is already populated, and not even just with the characters that were in the first film. Like the landlord, Mr. Ditkovich and his daughter. I mean, you would think that you had seen them in 3 or 4 other movies, and now they returned again, but they're just there for a few scenes, and they've never been in the films before. But they've Raimi gives them enough to do and creates the atmosphere and environment around them that you feel like you're watching the ongoing adventures of Peter Parker Spider-Man, even though there's only ever been one before this one.
You remember when they did the like really huge corporate machinations to get Spider-Man in the MCU, but also keep him in his own films? They should have written Ditkovich into that deal.
Yeah.
They should have like
Absolutely.
Just, yeah.
I would also say too that like to your point, Noah, like he populates New York with these slightly cartoonish but also really fun and believable characters. If it's oh my god, forgive me, the guy who runs the pizza place that he's working at the
Asif
beginning.
Manvi's character,
Yes.
yeah.
Mr. Aziz.
Him,
Mr. Aziz,
right.
yes.
Mr. Aziz. Or just kids on the street, or Joy Bryant's delivery of Go Spidey Go. Like it all just kind of feels very sort of adorably comforting in a way.
I was in watching this movie, I was thinking about how big of and I want to be clear that this is on a 2000s level. It's not compared to what we would do now, but how big of a step up from the first one this is in terms of character diversity. Like obviously all the main characters are white. I want to be clear on that.
Yes.
But when you have these little, whether it's one line or like a few scenes, that they increasingly, like Raimi's casting actors of color.
Sure.
When when Peter Parker, it's not Spider-Man, when he goes to save this little girl, like those characters are Chinese American immigrants who are here, and don't speak a lot of English. And it's not played as like silly. It's played as like, yeah, these people exist in this New York. And that's the thing I really love about these movies.
Yeah, and it does feel like it's 2 years between these films. We'll talk about the development a little bit, but I do feel like it's noticeable. I for whatever reason, why that happened is anyone's guess, but it's noticeable for sure. I do want to give a little bit of context for this film for the people that maybe have not seen Spider-Man 2. When a failed nuclear fusion experiment results in an explosion that kills his wife, Dr. Otto Octavius, played by Alfred Molina, is transformed into Dr. Octopus, a cyborg with deadly metal tentacles. Doc Ock blames Spider-Man for the accident and seeks revenge. Meanwhile, Spidey's alter ego Peter Parker faces fading powers and self-doubt. Complicating matters are his best friends, hatred for Spider-Man, and his true love's sudden engagement to another man. Spider-Man 2 opened on June 30th, 2004 against Fahrenheit 9/11, The Notebook, Dodgeball, and White Chicks.
Okay.
There you go. It would go on to make $795 million on a $200 million budget. It has 93% on Rotten Tomatoes from critics and 82% from audiences. Roger Ebert gave the film 4 stars and said, "Now this is what a superhero movie should be. Spider-Man 2 believes in its story in the same way serious comic readers believe when the adventures on the page express their own dreams and wishes. It's not camp and it's not nostalgia. It's not wall-to-wall special effects and it's not pickled in angst. It's simply and poignantly a realization that being Spider-Man is a burden that Peter Parker is not entirely willing to bear."
Ebert, when he wrote about superhero films, you got the sense that he's exactly the right age to have been like really excited about the Marvel revolution of the early 60s and like the emergence of the Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and all these things that Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were doing. And like you get that sense from this review, which I also reread, which like most of the issues he had with the first film, namely the special effects, haven't really been solved. They're slightly better, but yeah, he's just so taken with the story that he doesn't care.
100%. I want to read just one other quick little bit because I think it speaks to what you're saying, Emily. There are moviegoers who make a point of missing superhero movies, and I can't blame them, although I confess to a weakness for the genre. I liked both the Crow movies and Daredevil, Hulk, and X2, but not enough to recommend them to friends who don't like or understand comic book movies. Spider-Man 2 is another category. It's a real movie, full-blooded and smart with qualities, even those who have no idea who Stan Lee is. So I do think that yeah, I mean, I think it comes back to sort of what we were saying, which is like it's really character forward. I think that even X2 probably pushes a fair weather comic book fan to the fringes a little bit.
Although that is another sequel that I think is better than
superior to the original. Yeah. But it's again like it's like You got a lot of mutants in there, and I think that if you're not mutant friendly, I think you might sort of be like, well, what exactly are we doing here? A Peter Parker in a suit swinging around is one thing, but it does feel like when you start to get into too genre-y. I mean, now obviously all bets are off, and it's amazing what people are willing to ride for, and what sort of a fair weather Marvel fan will sit through is pretty crazy, all things considered, in the 20 years since this movie came out. But that's pretty nuts.
Yeah, I mean, I think about how mind-bending it was when Guardians came out, that they were willing to go so cosmic. Like that side of the Marvel universe was something that you wouldn't think they would ever touch back in the days of X-Men, where they were like, we can't even put them in things that looked like superhero costumes, or people were going to tune out. And now we have Ego the Living Planet appearing in Guardians of the Galaxy 2.
For sure. And I think that Guardians was, I mean, it was an August release. It was kind of, even prior to its release, it felt like everyone was like, this is the swing. We'll see if it connects. And then obviously all bets are off. But yes, Emily, you were going to say something?
No, I was really thinking about like how, Batman and Spider-Man are kind of the two most successful superheroes in terms of film adaptations, and I think it's because they're inherently grounded characters. Like obviously, like Spider-Man can fly around on his webs, but he is always baked into his DNA is that he's like a kid from working class kid who struggles, to cover his rent, and similar to Miles Morales in the Spider-Verse films. And Batman is he's not working class, that's for sure, but he's very much like working through his stuff by like just beating guys up because he doesn't have superpowers. And I'm always taken with like how those characters you can take outside the context of a cinematic universe and do fun things with, and they are almost harmed in some way by being forced into a cinematic universe. Like I think Tom Holland's a wonderful Spider-Man. I think the MCU interpretation of that character I struggle with a lot. And I think that that's because, to put him in the MCU, he can't be a working class kid. He has to be like Tony Stark's intern.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when they introduced him in Civil War, which I believe was the first time that we saw Holland's Spider-Man. I mean, people loved it, right? Because it was a new flavor, and he had such a aw shucks, like his Peter Parker is, I think, what people always kind of wanted from the Peter Parker personification, right? Of like a kid that felt just really kind of like wide-eyed and just sort of like very kind of just a lot of fun. And I remember, I mean, I don't like Civil War particularly, but I remember him showing up and I thought that was fun. And then Homecoming I liked its kind of John Hughesy kind of what if John Hughes was a Spider-Man movie vibe. What I didn't like is what you're referring to, Emily, which is that he's never allowed to be his own thing now because he's kissed into this MCU universe.
And it's also like he's lower status compared to a lot of his classmates, but it never feels like
that's true. Yeah,
like the class element is really a part of the story. And to be clear, I don't think it needs to be. I think you could do a Spider-Man story without that, but you are like tying one hand behind your back in a weird way.
Well, yeah, I mean, Tony Stark's his benefactor. Right. He's no longer a kid from Queens.
I mean, think about in Spider-Man 2, I was struck this time by how like humble Aunt May's little brownstone looks. Absolutely. Like it looks small, it looks cramped. The when he goes out to the back alley to take the trash out, it looks dark. It looks like maybe even a little dangerous in that part of New York. You think about the fact he never has any money. He's constantly he needs to get paid for his work at the Daily Planet, but Daily Bugle. Sorry, sure. Yeah. Nerd mistake.
Nerd mistake.
But Betsy Brandt tells him that he's already had the advance, so she can't give him any more money. I mean, all that stuff is very real and present in a way that I don't think is definitely not true. I think in the Tom Holland films.
For sure. I mean, he can't pay his rent. You know what I mean? He lives in a
rent.
He lives in a pretty disgusting apartment where he has to share a bathroom.
Yeah.
A communal bathroom to me that's the bar for like,
Yeah.
I don't know, man.
He's like living in a 1920s tenement that has just randomly been dropped into 2000. And like, obviously there are living situations like that in cities to this day. So I'm not trying to like make fun of them, but it very much has the feeling of like Raimi being like, oh, this is just like a time pocket in New York that has been dropped.
For sure. I mean, the rent stuff, the Aunt May can't pay her mortgage. Going to the bank actually made me think of Drag Me to Hell, which I love and has a similar I mean, I think this is a thing that affects everybody, but like there's something very emotional about having to go to get loans, having to, hat in hand, hope that someone will help you financially. And I think that that's going to hit everyone. And I think that that is a hallmark of Spider-Man, of the character being this sort of blue collar type character. And I think that Raimi understands that in these first two movies. I don't know that the third one really does that. And I would argue, I think to everyone's point, that where the franchise goes outside of the Miles Morales character, you kind of lose all of that. Like it's not even remotely in the Garfield Emma Stone movies.
I mean, how humiliating is it to have to ask Joel McHale for a free toaster and be told
There's
no?
Nothing more humiliating.
You have to have a $300 deposit limit to even get that. Anyway.
Yeah.
It is funny that this film has two like talk soup / the soup hosts in it. But I like the scene at the. I forgot what I was going to say. It's a very important point that I'll come back to.
So. Okay, great. I'm going to talk a little bit about the development and sort of the production of the movie just for a quick second. But like, obviously they were going to make a second movie. They basically were writing this movie before the first one even came out, really. I mean, I think that they knew that there were going to be more. They obviously signed Raimi to multiple films. Basically what happens is sort of April, May of 2002, after the first Spider-Man comes out, they announced that they're making another one. It's going to be titled The Amazing Spider-Man. David Koepp had 3 films, kind of very loosely 30,000 feet versions of these 3 films, which I think are kind of interesting, even if I'm not entirely sure I totally get what he was going for. But it seemed as though like he wanted the second one to be a lot darker, and then the third one was going to be more sort of family friendly. I think that he wanted to kill Gwen Stacy in the second movie. Gwen Stacy, who ultimately comes into play in the third one, but they don't really do anything with her. She obviously becomes the Emma Stone character in the next iteration of this. But Michael Chabon is hired to do a rewrite in September of 2002. His draft had a younger Doc Ock who is infatuated with Mary Jane. His mechanical limbs use endorphins to counterbalance the pain of his attached. I don't know. There's like all sorts of stuff. I mean, what's interesting is we don't really know what vestiges of Chabon's draft is ultimately on the screen, but he does get a screen story by credit, which means that something comes over. I don't know what. Obviously, it's not this young Doc Ock stuff, but like something comes over, which is interesting. I don't know what.
I love, obviously Alfred Molina was like cast. I think they had several other actors in mind, I love that they're just straightforwardly like, yeah, he's in love with his wife and her death drives him nuts. And also she's Broadway legend Donna Murphy. And also it's pretty clear she thinks Peter Parker's gay. It's pretty clear she's like,
she's certainly, she's a little bit like, so do you have a girlfriend? But I mean, Ed Harris, Chris Cooper, Christopher Walken were kicked around as potential Doc Ocks. I mean, I can see it. I think that Chris Walken maybe less so.
I think Walken would have broken the movie, but those other guys would have been fine.
Ed Harris, I could see for sure. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, talking about Alfred Molina's amazing performance as Otto Octavius. Great, because he does kind of look like the comic book character. He's got the sort of the roundness a little bit of the comic book character. Also, making him older means that when he kidnaps Aunt May, That also is a callback to the comics where Aunt May briefly kind of half dated Otto Octavius or had some kind of romantic relationship
Interesting. Okay.
with him in the old comics. But you mentioned that he's driven crazy by the loss of Donna Murphy, and who would not be? I mean, obviously.
Yeah.
Correct.
But also because in a classic, I think, very Sam Raimi-esque touch, his entire operation, his entire multi-armed, independently controlled arms things is controlled by a tiny little inhibitor chip in the back of his neck. He's like, don't worry, it's all going to be fine. I had this tiny inhibitor chip that will prevent the arms from taking over my consciousness. And then, of course, as soon as everything goes haywire, they cut to the back of his neck, and the inhibitor chip has been smashed.
Out. Yeah. I mean, it's an amazing moment when people are like, those arms seem pretty dangerous. Are you sure that you want them controlling? He's like, oh, don't worry. This tiny little thing is all fine.
Got it.
Yeah, I mean,
it's amazing to me how much all of this setup is a rework of Green Goblin in the first film, and you don't actually feel it at all. Like Defoe's performance in the first film is very much like, yeah, it's a guy who's caught between his kinder self and his like maniacal, insane criminal self. And he's got this important relationship with a family member, and Harry's involved somehow, and he's a mentor to Peter. And like, you don't ever really feel it. And I think it's because Defoe is so unhinged and Molina is so like, even when he's crazy, he feels like kind of like he's gonna go home and like take care of 7 kids in like a TGIF sitcom called The Octopus Has 8 Arms. I don't know.
I mean, I do think that it's funny you bring that up, because watching this the other day at the end, I did find myself going like, he definitely does have the Doc Ock and Green Goblin have similarities. I think that the key to this for me is that at the end of the movie, obviously Doc Ock doesn't want to die a monster, and literally says that. Like he wants his final thing on this earth to be saving people, which is not, spoiler, what Green Goblin wants. But I also think that the Jekyll and Hyde-ness of Green Goblin and Osborn is so much more dialed up, to your point, Emily. Like you don't feel that duality raging inside of Octavius to the same degree, which is a good thing or maybe a bad thing, depending on, maybe it muddies the waters, but it certainly makes him different. Raimi talks a little bit about how he cast Alfred Molina for part of the reasons you were talking about, Noel. He's a bigger guy. He wanted someone that was an imposing figure, and you're not going to get that from Ed Harris or Chris Cooper, I think, to the same degree. In terms of other casting, I'd be remiss to not talk about this whole fiasco with Tobey Maguire's back for a quick second.
Yeah.
He makes Seabiscuit in 2002. He apparently has a pre-existing back condition that he suffers while doing Seabiscuit. Raimi heard that Maguire could be paralyzed if there was an injury to his back. Jake Gyllenhaal is cast to replace him. The two actors resemble each other. Gyllenhaal's dating Kirsten Dunst at this time. Maguire's girlfriend, whose father is Ron Meyer, who was the head of Universal Studios at the time, apparently is instrumental in him regaining the role and the salary of $17 million. Tobey Maguire seems to be if Molly's Game is to be believed,
right? Not a great guy.
Tobey Maguire seems to be a somewhat sketchy individual to some degree or another as a human. I would not put it past him that this whole back situation was all leverage in order to get more money out of Sony. Whatever. He's fine. He did the role. Whatever.
Do you think there's a meta element to like Spider-Man losing his powers and the scene where he actually falls off a building and hurts his back? You think that's kind of an inside?
I wonder. Yeah. Do you think that's a winky thing?
No, maybe.
Yeah.
I love that I love that as we're recording these episodes, Tobey Maguire's back in the news, and by that I mean celebrity gossip, because he was spotted like dating a 20-year-old, and every article's like, she's 1 year younger than Spider-Man 1. And I'm like, how am I still alive?
She's like 2 years older than his daughter. I mean, it's just like, it's all fucked up.
You know what? Love is love.
Oh, is that love? I mean, I don't. My whole thing with this back situation is that it was. I remember it being in the news. Like I remember people like very infrequently would, you know, Hollywood bartering contract negotiation stuff ever actually like pre. This is like still kind of pre, I don't want to say pre-internet, but like my point is this broke through.
Sure,
People were
yeah.
actually talking about Tobey Maguire's back for like 3 weeks. It
Yeah,
was
no, listen, I remember these times. I mean, I used to subscribe to Premiere Magazine, Entertainment
sure.
Weekly. They covered the business side of this thing as much as
Yeah.
the, everything else. And back that was the days of, Ain't It Cool News,
Yes.
Comic Book Resources, all these different websites that would have like
Mhm.
regular, gossipy updates that were
Yeah.
being leaked to them of what was going on. So yeah, no, I think we knew a lot more back then about what was going on in the making of movies than we do
Sure.
today, where these things seem to pop up out of nowhere, and we're like, "What is this thing?"
100%. I mean, I think Gyllenhaal probably would have been fine. I mean, I like Jake Gyllenhaal. I don't know. His career would be very different, I imagine, had he taken over the role. Um, you know, I,
He
he's
gets to
even
be in a
talked about it.
Spider-Man movie many years later.
He would be in a spider. And by the way,
He
I
was
liked
he
him.
was yeah, he was good. And you
Yeah.
know what? He was fun. They should bring him back. I think he's dead, but they should bring him back.
I
Yeah, I
don't
think
know.
he's dead.
I think the thing about Maguire, barring however he is
Mhm.
off screen, and obviously we also have James Franco in this movie, so
We do.
there's issues. But
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think as Peter Parker and as Spider-Man, if in fact Tobey Maguire is even underneath the mask in those scenes where he's being Spider-Man, um, what I like about Tobey Maguire as the lead for these films is I think he really does kind of have a Sam Raimi aspect to him. Like, have you ever
Mhm.
seen Sam Raimi? He looks a little bit like Tobey Maguire. He's
He
like a
does.
little, kind of handsome in an offbeat sort of way, a little meek. He likes to dress in snappy clothes, and he's always comes to the set in a suit and tie, like the good little boy. I mean, all that stuff I think is reflected in the character, and I think that what Sam Raimi brings to Spider-Man 2 is multiple things, and I want to get into a couple of other things later on.
Yeah.
But his love of kind of comedy is sort of slapstick, Three Stooges, everyman, knucklehead comedy that is especially evident in the first hour of this movie in sequences like where Spider-Man has to save the day and also get the pizzas to the building in the right, to deliver to Emily Deschanel in just the right nick of time, and then she refuses to pay for the pizzas, and he's kind of a sad sack walking away. I mean, the whole sort of sad sack walking away element that comes up over and over again in this film, like him grabbing a cocktail from a passing tray at the big society event with a gigantic oversized umbrella and it being empty. That's just
I'm trying
great.
to get hors d'oeuvres from multiple plates, and they're constantly being taken away from him. Yeah.
Yes, or the long, or with the pizza scene again, he comes out of the broom closet after changing clothes, and it
Oh
takes
my
like
god.
a solid
It
minute
goes
of him
on for so
trying.
long.
Anyway, but I think that that Sam Raimi like puts himself into Tobey Maguire's character Peter Parker a lot, and having this kind of nebbishy being put upon aspect, the world is against him kind of thing.
He's very Charlie Brown, now that you put it that way.
Yes.
But
Yes.
also at the same time, he's Spider-Man. And like I like that dichotomy of like I think I love when a superhero movie, because I'm Superman was my intro to the whole genre. And I love when a superhero character is like, well, the alter ego, people kind of can't buy that he's the superhero just because he's such a like loser.
Well,
Like
that's
or a
and I
dork, you know? Mhm.
100%. And I would say too that that's the I would say something they stripped out of. I mean, certainly Garfield and to some degree Holland. You know,
Every time you
neither
say Garfield, I picture the Bill Murray Garfield movies, and I'm like, well, Garfield, everyone knows he's Garfield.
Andrew Garfield. Yeah, it's they don't feel like losers. Is sort of kind of the. I mean, not to be harsh on the character, but that there is this Charlie Brown. Oh, nothing ever goes my way about the Maguire Raimi version that I think either A, they felt wasn't cool enough, or B, they wanted to differentiate. So they, made it a different thing. But like Mark Webb's version of those movies is, I mean, it's so busy and it's hollow, and there's a but like the only good thing about them is the chemistry between Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone, which is palpable. But these films, to your point, Noel, do feel a lot more director infused in a way that certainly the franchise doesn't feel as it moves past Raimi. I do think it's worth saying that the initial script of is it Goff and Miller, I think is Alfred Goff and Miles Miller, Spider-Man battles Doc Ock, the Lizard, and Black Cat. So that was going to be real busy.
Yeah. That is just Batman Returns, because they're like, well, we gotta have a lady that he can be tempted by. And I think one of the really smart things about these movies is they are just love stories. I've said this in the previous episode, but it is in some ways a sincere romantic drama about two kids like figuring out their relationship issues. And I mean, I love that and I'm jumping ahead to the end, but at the end of this film, she gets to be like, this is my choice. I want this from my life, and I've made it, and now we're gonna go forward. And then she's immediately like, what have I done? And like, that's so it's such a smart way to present relationships. And I don't know that other superhero movies, period, really get at that level of like understanding of human behavior. And obviously this movie is written by the guy who wrote Ordinary People.
Well, I was literally just going to say, like, the Alvin Sargent component of this is the X factor that I think, specifically with this film, but also with the first one as well, of those quiet scenes between Peter and Mary Jane, or Peter and Aunt May, are so lived in and so heartfelt and so genuine that it's like, like that's kind of the DNA, like that's the bearing walls of these movies that gets lost.
They don't let Peter or the audience off the hook at any point. Like constantly, like, well, this is the time he's finally going to make it to the play on time, but he doesn't. This is the time he's going to be there in class, but no, you missed class. I mean, it's like over and over again, everyone is just judging him for because they don't know who he is, so they think he's lazy, they think he's forgetful, they think he doesn't care. And they really, I mean, the way that Kirsten Dunst plays those scenes, especially when she's in the play, reciting lines from The Importance of Being Earnest, which is a very telling thing to be playing at the time, and using those lines to kind of reflect her feelings about the fact that Peter is there or isn't there or whatever it might be. It makes that payoff at the end, all the more satisfying, and the little extra The Graduate-esque twist of the final shot being her staring off at him, going away like, what the hell have I just done?
What have I done? I mean, there's also something so, it is screenwriting 101, but it is so satisfying that the only way Peter can be good at being Peter is by not being Spider-Man. And that and truly this idea that like he can only be what Mary Jane wants him to be by negating this other thing. I mean, the raindrops falling on your head sequence, which is wonderfully theatrical and silly, and ends with a goofy freeze frame, is just amazing, because it's playfully highlighting how wonderful life could be theoretically for Peter if he didn't have Spider-Man, which is obviously a lie. But it's just, the movie is so deft at navigating those tonal and thematic ideas. It's pretty spectacular.
It's also like a huge homage to another film that's a big influence on this, Superman 2, which I think Noel can speak to. I haven't seen it in many years, but it's I do think it's like, it is interesting and so corny, but it works so well when it's like, well, you have to figure out what you want to be a hero. And then he immediately figures out when he's like, oh, I want this girl, but I can't have her. The third act of this movie, I remember watching this in 2004. I liked it. It ended up on my top 10 that year, but I was not like enthralled by it. I was not in love with it. And the reason it was on my top 10 is because basically from that scene, when they're in the cafe talking about their relationship to the end of the movie. Everything is note perfect. Even the one thing I kind of still have issue with in this, which is that Harry's plot is kind of sidelined.
Yeah.
Even that works in the third act because it's like, well, here I'm finally
Yeah.
unleashing my plot. I learned my friend's secret. It staggered me to my core. I'm setting up the third film. Yeah, it like that third act is so good in every way.
It really, really is. I mean, you know, I don't, it, so I mentioned this to Emily, and it's worth saying, I saw this in 2004. I liked it fine. Spider-Man was never and continues to not like be my guy. I like the character, don't get me wrong, but
Well, it's
like it's
because
not my favorite. Yeah.
you're a jock and can't relate to a nerd.
Yeah,
You
that's
can
what it
admit
is. Yeah. Um, so I saw this movie in 2004 and I liked it. But it almost immediately was put in the canon of like this might be the best comic book movie ever made, like within that year. And the love for it has only grown since then. And I'm happy to say that I now get it. Like it's taken me some time, not till this rewatch, but like within the last probably 5 or 6 years, I finally feel as though like I can, and maybe it's because I've been so fucking inundated with so many other inferior comic book movies that I'm like finally realizing how lovely this movie is. But yeah.
I
I'm
do
looking.
think some. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm saying I'm looking at my top 10 for 2004 right now, and I didn't have it on there either. I would have thought, I would have sworn to you 5 minutes ago that, oh yes, Spider-Man 2 was in my top 10. It was in my honorable mentions, but that's the year of Eternal Sunshine,
Yeah.
Life Aquatic, I Heart Huckabees, Kill Bill Volume 2, and my number 5 movie that year, The Incredibles.
Yeah, sure.
So
Which is
speaking of
also
superheroes,
yeah.
I think today I
what
would definitely flip those around.
That's the thing that I was just going to mention is that like Incredibles and Spider-Man 2 kind of fed each other in a fun way, where like they both came out this year. They had very interesting, heady takes on the format. They had fun action sequences. I still love both of them a lot. But yeah, like if I were to make a list of 2004 this year, Spider-Man 2 would be in the top five somewhere, along with some of the ones you mentioned, Noel. It just is, to me, every time I watch it, it grows a little in my estimation. I genuinely, it's becoming one of my favorite films ever made to just put on and look at. And like, yeah, I would not have predicted that back then.
I was talking one other point I want to make about the Sam Raimi-ness. There was a thing that went around. I guess it was 2, maybe 3 years ago on Twitter, where people someone had put together a short clip of the sequence where they try to cut off Dr. Octopus's arms. And they flail around everywhere, and you see the wonderful shadows of the arms going up, and you see the snap zooms into the nurses screaming, and lots of screaming in this movie, by the way. Lots of snap zooms to people screaming, really wonderful screams, like
right to camera too.
Brian De Palma and blowout screams. I mean, fantastic stuff. But people are passing around that sequence to be like, oh my God, can you believe how hard this movie went back in 2004? I mean, this is body horror. I mean, this is like scarier than most scary movies, this sequence. And it was in the middle of a superhero movie that lots of kids went to go see. And it's a lot of the movies like that. And I think it really is speaks to, I guess, Raimi being given the free reign to do more Raimi stuff to make it more like the Evil Dead 2. But also the fact that it works. It makes gives the movie more passion, more blood, more excitement, more sense of stakes.
Absolutely. I mean, it's probably, I mean, I don't know. The train sequence is probably my favorite scene of the movie because like it's great. But I do love that operating room sequence. Um, for the reasons that you just illustrated, Noel, but I also just think it's funny that it almost wasn't in the movie. It was supposed to be a test sequence just for the arms, right? Like it was just a special effects kind of previs situation. And then it seemed as though Raimi just had so much fucking fun doing it, and he was just like, "Well, now this has to go in there." It's, I do think, I mean, it's classically Raimi. We talked Evil Dead's, we talked Armory of Darkness for our 92 pod. Emily and I talked about that, and it's definitely him at his most Evil Dead. I mean, you've got nurses being dragged by their fingernails into darkness. You've got just like, you have literally a chainsaw. Like it is wonderful that in the middle of a Spider-Man movie, he just gets to scratch that Evil Dead itch that he has. But I think also it's interesting because like it's rare that third movies stick the landing. Generally speaking, it feels as though trilogies just have hard times. And I do wonder whether or not, you would think that the studio, after the rave reviews for this movie and the enormous box office success of it, that they'd let him do what he wanted to do. But they just fucking forced him to do the Venom shit.
Well,
and it's a bummer.
The second film was a step down from the first one box office wise. And like, that's pretty common for a sequel, but it does feel like they were like, well, no, these were just going to keep making more and more money, right? We'd better. Right. And like, I do think that, if Raimi had continued making super Spider-Man films, as like was originally the plan, we would look at 3 as like, we would look at 3 as like a weird transition point, because it does kind of close the story of these first 3 films on a human level, but like there's going to continue to be superheroes and so on and so forth. And like a thing I think about a lot is that in the comics, and I primarily knew Spider-Man through the newspaper comic strip about him, which is a very different thing from the comic books. But like, he's married to MJ in those. He seems like he has a pretty good life. He's married to a movie star. Like a lot of the stuff that makes him interesting as a comic book character is also leached out of those. And I'm thinking a lot about like how the further you get from teenage kid who has money troubles, because he and MJ have to get married and she has to become a successful actress, and like all of that's going to just complicate things. So the further you get from that, the harder it is to make him an interesting character, and like, or make him a character true to his roots, I should say. There have been good stories told in that vein. And like, that's one reason, the comics keep resetting him to be like, well, now he doesn't know MJ at all or whatever. But I think that the Spider-Verse movies figured out a smart way to do that, which is that the Peter Parker we spend most of our time with in those movies is a schlub who's lost his wife. Yeah. And it's like, oh, that's how you do it,
Yeah.
I do think like the end of Spider-Man 3 is surprisingly melancholy. It like the last shot always surprises me. I've only probably seen the film like 2 or 3 times, but every time I'm like, so that's where they decided to end this movie. Obviously there was a lot of talk of doing a 4th one. Ultimately, it just became, I think, prohibitively expensive with Toby and Raimi and Kirsten, that the studio decided, let's go back to zero and, pay people poorly, I guess. But I do think that, there's even been talk of them trying to do it still, right? That like Toby and Kirsten would come back for a Raimi Spider-Man 4, many years in the future or whatever. But I kind of wish he got to do his 4th one, if for no other reason than I think there probably would have been a recalibration. I think that it probably would have been strong. But
and for poor Dylan Baker's sake.
I know.
Yeah, I know.
He would have been great. He would have been a great lizard.
It's like one of those great Easter eggs for Spider-Man fans. Oh, well, that's the lizard. Eventually, we'll get the lizard. I mean, never got the lizard.
Not in this one.
Yeah.
I just, because it's worth talking about for a quick second here, just the David Koepp stuff that I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier. He originally planned a trilogy, a Gwen Stacy, Harry Osborn story, but spaced out everything differently. The sequel was titled The Amazing Spider-Man. What's weird is that he planned to have a smaller budget of $75 million. The movie's length would be shorter. It would be more R-rated in tone. All of this seems very strange. This was David Koepp's idea for the second Spider-Man movie. What are the examples?
Well, I know that you admire David Koepp, but I don't understand that at all.
I admire him fine. This is crazy. I'm not writing for this. It was going to be smaller. Peter Parker was going to learn his parents weren't killed in a random plane crash, and that they secretly worked for the government, which comes into play in the next iteration. You had Doc Ock killing Captain Stacy. Basically, he quote unquote said that it follows the sort of Empire Strikes Back model. Don't see that in any way. But then apparently, finally, the third film, which would be titled The Spectacular Spider-Man, would have been a completely different villains, and it would have been more family friendly for kids. I don't really get it. It seems as though he kind of was like transposing the OG Star Wars trilogy sort of onto this in some way, but like extrapolating all sorts of weird stuff.
I think he's trying to make the Batman movies. Like
Also
that's
possible.
that's the like thing he's looking toward.
Yeah.
And Raimi's trying to make the Superman movies to the degree that like even when he does Venom, it's kind of like the evil Superman in Superman 3, just a little bit. And it's like
Sure.
that divide is really interesting because for the most part, the Burton Batman are like set the template for what's to come, and then Marvel like builds
Yeah.
upon that. But yeah, like Raimi's like looking at entirely different influences, which is another fun thing about this movie being made by him.
It is, you know, it is interesting to think of. Like Kevin Feige is an executive on this movie, right? Like Kevin Feige is involved through Stan Lee and what have you. I'm just curious as to like when do the gears start turning in his head as to how to weaponize, for lack of a word, all of this stuff. Because even when you look at Iron Man and Iron Man 2 for that matter, right? Like those don't feel like they're starting what ultimately comes in its sort of wake. It's interesting.
Iron Man's very grounded. Yeah, like that
Yeah.
first Iron Man film. Like I was talking last night with my wife about these Raimi Spider-Man movies, and I was like, I think these movies are about real people. And can you say that about any other superhero films at all? And she was like, Dark Knight kind of, not really others, except kind of the first Iron Man. And then she was like, but I don't know that Marvel movies are superhero movies. I think they're their own thing. And I don't know that she's right, but I also don't know that she's wrong. But also, it's inarguably those movies are not about real people, but they're not about real people in the way that like Dynasty or Dallas aren't about real people. They're like, they're big and soapy and silly, you know?
Yes. Yes.
I will say that I do think that my favorite maybe of the MCU standalone-ish movies is the first Ant-Man movie, which does feel smaller in that sense. It's like it's not completely integrated into the larger heading towards Endgame kind of narrative. The second Ant-Man movie definitely goes into the whole Endgame thing, but yeah, that first movie I think is I can see Paul Rudd being a person.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's true. And no, I mean, there are many ways that Ant-Man is smaller. Let's just be
Yes.
clear about that.
Yes.
I do think, I mean, I do wonder whether or not part of that, I don't disagree with you, Noel, but I do wonder if part of that is a reaction to the Edgar Wright development of that film.
Oh yeah, could be, yeah.
And hitting a release date and everything just getting real stripped down and just being like, let's get this thing down to basics. It's not to say that that's not the film that they ultimately made, but I do wonder like if there's something in the water there on that one. But yeah, I mean, I do agree that Iron Man is surprisingly grounded and character forward. I think a lot of that is the Favreau involvement. I think a lot of that is him seeing Batman Begins and sort of trying to sort of find a way to start a thing. I really like the first Iron Man a lot. I think it's a great movie.
Yeah,
I like the third Iron Man.
I like the first Iron Man quite a bit. I think it's hard to watch now because of what it spawned, but when you watch it, you're like, how did this spawn all of that? It is that interesting conundrum. Yeah.
And you look at those three leads of Robert Downey Jr., Gwyneth Paltrow, and Jeff Bridges giving just like great performances, right? Like it feels like an OG comic book movie in a way that kind of nothing in its wake is. It's very strange. Yeah, I mean, even the second one, which is just like, I mean, that's just a mess. But I want to talk about the bank sequence for a second.
Yep.
I love all the climbing up the wall stuff with Doc Ock and him kidnapping May. I love all of that. I love that moment when the music drops out and it's just the sound of them falling and punching each other. Like there's just some really beautiful directorial stuff going on in that sequence.
Also, I like the fact that for the second time in the movie, when trouble starts, somebody who's close to Peter Parker sees him run away. Like he just can't win. This
like
guy.
A coward.
Yes. Yeah. Every single time.
My favorite line in this movie, it makes me laugh every time, is, "Hey, he stole that guy's pizzas." Which is kind of calling back to an earlier moment. But yes, the thing where people are like, well, this guy, even Spider-Man, they're a little bit suspicious of, thanks to J. Jonah Jameson, who we do have
Your
to talk
husband.
about, but continue.
Yeah,
My
which we
husband.
will talk about,
Yeah.
obviously.
Yeah.
I do think that the you know, as sort of a winky Raimi moment is May hanging from the umbrella, and you think that she's about to fall, and then she just lands on the
Yes.
windowsill. Right? Like it's just that type of stuff.
But there's a ton of stuff all throughout the entire movie. I mean, I made the whole series of notes of just marveling at like flying shards of glass that briefly show the reflection of Donna Murphy screaming, or the whole sequence where Peter and MJ are having coffee and then the car comes flinging in. I mean, there's so many like. And we'll have to get to the train sequence again at some point, but yeah, I mean every single cut and shot. I mean, it's just I don't know the imagination. It feels some of these movies I think feel storyboarded in a bad way, where like they doesn't seem like I don't know, it's like some of it was just way too planned out, maybe a little stiff. This to me feels storyboarded in a dynamic way, like a comic book. Like it really does feel like images from a comic book strung together like a series of panels, while also still being cinematic. I mean, this feels like Spider-Man. It feels like Raimi at the same time.
I think that Raimi has always had a very energetic camera, and I think that makes it feel very kind of like boyishly playful, right? Like a kid who's just like, look at what I get to do, right? Mm-hmm. Like, and I think that that's infectious, right? Like as a viewer, I mean, our eyes are the camera, obviously, but just also feeling like the guy behind the camera is so gleeful at what's happening. I remember the teaser trailer for this, which was the coffee shop, mm-hmm. and the boom, boom, and the camera kind of jutting forward. Yes. I mean, like that stuff is just like, it's great. It's addictive.
It's also interesting how you mentioning how many shots have like shattered glass in them. That is very much like a classic. Oh, someone's psyche is like really struggling under the strain of something, but you never feel it in the way that you would feel it, if like Peter was staring into the mirror and the mirror suddenly snapped. Like it's like a subtle way to sort of clue you into his psychological state while also just being a cool way to film things. And then when he's back, famously, it's just like a single shot of a newspaper, which is, not at all like it is a unified whole. And like, I'm probably drawing too much into this, but it does feel like there is sort of an interesting using those weird insert shots to like tell the story of his reunification as a person.
I mean, I agree with you 100%. I think that both these movies, the first Spider-Man and this one, both use newspapers to tell story, which is just lovely. But man on the street stuff, people talking about Spider-Man, to help bridge you along. It's really smart narrative storytelling in the sense that it doesn't bog things down. It's quick and it's short and it gets you moving. This movie's 2 hours. This movie would be 220 or 230 today. I mean,
it's like, yeah, like I was looking up the running times of the Spider-Verse films and I like both of them a lot, but the first one is an hour 56 and the second one is 220. And I'm like, you kind of feel it in that second one,
That's why it's funny to think about David Koepp wanting to make the second Spider-Man movie shorter and smaller. And, I mean, I think that's a good instinct in some ways, though. I think more people should think about, okay, we spent all of our money and time on the first one. Now let's just tell an ordinary story. Let's just get on with it,
Totally. I mean, I know there's a lot of people, make movies short again, but I do think that, I mean, a movie is as long as a movie needs to be. The problem is that it doesn't most times need to be as long as they are. And I think that that's just, bloatedness. I think also just they spend so much goddamn money on these set pieces nowadays that the studios are just reticent to trim them or pull them back in any way. It's a bummer.
I was hanging out with my friend and fellow film critic Scott Tobias a couple months ago at a film festival, and we were staying in the same hotel room, and we had the TV on, and they were showing Avengers Endgame on FX, and the 14 endings of Avengers Endgame. I mean, it goes on so long that there's literally on FX a commercial break in the middle of all the endings. Like we have the funeral commercial break, and there's still more to go after that. I mean, it's a lot.
It's a lot. Yeah. speaking to the tone and speaking to what Raimi is able to get away with and execute, the scene with Uncle Ben in the heavenly car, we'll call it, or whatever that is.
Yeah, that works.
It shouldn't work, but it does, right? Like that could be super hokey, and yet it totally works. And it's not even really explained, by the way, like where it's coming from.
When Harry gets a similar one where suddenly he just sees his dad in the mirror, it also works, even though you're like, this is ridiculous.
Yeah. It just goes to show that like that Raimi has sort of created this path for himself that allows him this flexibility to, I mean, we talked about this on the Spider-Man episode, but like you have my God, why am I drawing a blank on Harry's father's name?
Norman Osborn?
Yes,
Norman.
Osborn. Yes, of course. Sorry. The having him talk to a mask, having him, having him talking to himself. This comic booky kind of logic that's existing that he's able to get the audience to buy into. That's hard to do, and the Batman movies don't even do that. Because there's like what
I remember very strongly the commentary track for the movie Piranha.
Sure.
Joe Dante on that commentary track. There's a sequence early in that film where they're passing through kind of a mad scientist lab kind of thing, and there is a claymation character that appears very briefly on the screen. And in the commentary track, Joe Dante says, people fought me on this, but I wanted to get this in the movie early because I wanted people to understand what kind of movie this is. This is this kind of movie. That's the way he phrases it. It's like, yeah. I mean, I think that's what Sam Raimi does too. It's like it's going to be the kind of movie where somebody fights with a broom closet for a minute, and then we'll get back to the superhero action.
Yeah, Dante's a guy that like, I just what a career that could have been. You know what I mean? Like he's made a lot of movies that I really love, but I also just feel like he didn't get this, right? Like he didn't get a Raimi-esque shot at something that could have elevated him to a place where, and instead he kind of, he got Small Soldiers, and that's what that is. But
I mean, Gremlins 2 obviously was should have been the biggest hit.
Emily, what do you think of Mary Jane's British accent?
It's wonderful. Everything that Kirsten Dunst does in these films is impeccable and cannot be topped. And it's silly, but also like it's believable that she would be like getting good press or getting like a good like boost from this performance, because it's not like a great British accent, but it's also not embarrassingly bad. So it does feel like a little bit like a Broadway play as imagined by people who've never seen a Broadway play. Which I'm sure like, Sam Raimi has. He wears suits, but
it feels like a Max Fisher performance, for instance.
Yeah.
But one little short nice touch with the whole importance of being earnest sequences is the night that she thinks Peter's coming, and of course he can't because of the this trouble he has to take care of. But before when she's getting ready to go on stage, and her partner, her fellow actress, is like talking about how excited she is, and she just kind of says in a casually offhanded way, "Never know who's coming." I don't know. That's just adorable. It's like really well played by Kirsten Dunst. It's a really nice little bit of writing. It might even be, ad-libbed or inserted by Raimi and the actress. I don't know, but it's certainly you don't need it, and yet you do need it. It's one of those small little touches that makes this movie so special, I think.
Yeah. I also think that Mary Jane's performance, or Mary Jane's character in this movie, it just feels a lot less. It's a more subtle performance from Kirsten Dunst in this movie. It feels a lot more sort of, I really love her in the first one, but it's a little more peaky. Like it has these kind of, ups and downs. Whereas in this, it feels like there's just a much more sort of more subtle arc that's existing to the character that I like. And I think part of that might have to do with the fact that like, there isn't as much to do with her in this movie, if that makes sense. She's so instrumental to the plot of the first movie and the moves of what's going on. I felt in this film, what I liked about it is that the scenes that we have with her are her just kind of like living her life, and Peter's just trying desperately to wedge himself into it, and she's just sort of like fuck off and go away. Like, and I appreciate that about it. You know, even when she is part of action sequences in the third act of the movie, she's not really interacting with Spider-Man at all in most of this film.
I've 100% said this in an earlier episode, so please stop me. But it does feel like Mary Jane Watson and Lois Lane are kind of the great superhero girlfriends, especially on screen, because they have their own lives, they have their own jobs, they have their own things that they're doing, and occasionally a superhero saves their lives, and they're like, I guess I kind of love you, but also I don't. This guy over here, I don't know what to make of him. He's just always around.
But you totally believe her though when she tells Peter, you know, don't let me down, you know, don't disappoint me, knowing that he's probably going to. Like, and you also, you know, speaking again about a small moment in the film that doesn't need to be there, but also makes a huge world of difference. There's a sequence where she's at home with Jonah Jameson's son, and decides to kiss him upside down to try to recreate the spark she had with Spider-Man, and you know, he says, I'm back on the moon, are you? She doesn't respond.
She's just like, no,
like, yeah, no, this is not going to do it for me. Yeah.
I mean, speaking of kissing, the coffee shop moment when she's to camera,
yeah.
It's fucking incredible. I mean, it's just it is so silly. It's 1 inch from being just completely, you know, untenable, and yet he's doing it. It's why I think, you know, not to belabor the point, but it's why I think 3 tips for a lot of people, because I think just the balance is off. You know, there's kind of too many elements, and he just can't juggle them all successfully. Some of it works, obviously, some of it doesn't. And I think that these first 2 films are just a pretty perfect juggling act of all that tone.
Yeah.
I when Peter decides not to be Spider-Man, that the costume,
a choice we've all made.
Yeah, I mean, we've all been there.
Highly relatable.
The costume in the garbage is such a perfectly iconic shot.
Right.
That I also just want it
from the comic books.
From the comic books.
From the cover of the comic book, you know, costume in the trash can, Spider-Man No More. That is the actual Marvel Comics cover.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
I just want to quickly highlight for a second that Don Burgess shoots the first film. Bill Pope shoots this film. I think Don Burgess is a very good cinematographer. I think Bill Pope is an incredible cinematographer. And I think that upgrade is felt just in terms of the aesthetics of this film. Not that the first one doesn't look great, but I mean, Bill Pope is Bill Pope.
he's one of the best at knowing how to shoot practical imagery in ways that CGI can be used to enhance it. And I feel like his skill set is sorely lacking in current Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, he shot Shang-Chi, for instance, a movie that I would never have known Bill Pope shot.
Which I like more than both of you, but yeah, it's
I
much.
I didn't dislike it. I liked it in the theater. I think part of it was also just like it was post-pandemic, and I was just happy to be in a movie theater.
Yeah, I think if I'd seen it in a theater, I would have liked it. But seeing it on cable again, I got about an hour into it and said, I don't need it. I don't need this. You know. Yeah.
In the theater, I there were some sequences that really popped for me. It all, unfortunately, due to, I imagine, post-production, what have you, it's a gray, muddy mess at the end, visually. But I mean, I don't know. I just, Bill Pope is one of those guys who shot some of my favorite films. So, you know, I just expect him to keep doing that, and that's not always going to be the case. So that's just what it is, right? Like, but Peter at that point decides to hang up his spurs. And there are a couple moments for me when he turns his back on a kid being beaten up in an alleyway. It's a real, like, Jesus Christ, we're okay. And then him running into a burning building without powers is tremendous. That whole sequence is it's just wonderful. It perfectly underlines what it means to be a hero.
Yeah. And he's like, one of the cool things about that sequence in the burning building is you can see he like still has these residual Spider-Man after effects. Like he can jump across a burning gap and hold on to a thing with one hand while clutching a child, which I've tried and cannot do. But like
you try, and you're a hero. But at the same
time, he's like not able. He's not able in the way he could if he could just like swing in there. It's also an interesting mirror of that first film, where he runs back in as Spider-Man and it turns out to be a trap set by the Green Goblin. No, here
Yes.
it's really just like a 2-year-old that he has to
Yes.
save, and like he can
Yes.
only do it. It's this movie mirrors the first one in so many ways that should feel unsatisfying and yet feel satisfying absolutely every single time. It's kind of magic.
I think also all that stuff,
totally agree.
all that stuff really does illustrate what the stakes of this are. Like, it's like him not being Spider-Man is really not so much of an option. I mean, he's gonna have to live in a world where where terrible things happen that he could possibly fix, and he's choosing not to do so. And it's not even going to necessarily make his relationship better, because when he's talking to MJ after he's given all that up, she looks at him and says, "You're," with a long pause, "different," and she doesn't mean it in a good way. There's something about him being Spider-Man that she likes, even though she doesn't know that he is, or know that that's the reason why he's never around, or any of that kind of stuff. But there's something he carries within him as Spider-Man that appeals to her, and she can tell that that's not him anymore, and she doesn't like it.
It's fascinating to me the way this movie hinges a lot on both MJ and May simultaneously knowing and not knowing that
Mhm.
he's Spider-Man. Like
Yes.
this like sort of dual consciousness they hold in their head. And of course MJ finds out and May does not. But like that scene, that again, another scene that should not work, where Rosemary Harris delivers the corniest speech of all time, and yet
Mhm.
you're like, oh my God, there's something in my eye. Is like, yeah, it's she absolutely knows who he is, and also she won't let herself think it. And it's like so skillfully played.
Yeah, I mean, I it's funny you bring up that line, Noel, of her being like, "You're different," because I think that Kirsten delivers it so perfectly,
Yeah.
right? Like it's what in lesser hands would be a throwaway line has the sort of the power of her unsureness of like, what is it? Something's off. I can't pinpoint it. Um, I'm not buying what you're selling right now, in a way that I think is just really interesting and nuanced. Again, Kristen Dunst in this movie, there's something so subtly powerful about what she's doing in almost every scene that I think she's much better in this than she is in the first one. And I really like her in the first one. I just think that like Mary Jane isn't written as perhaps as interestingly as she is in this film. Because I think this movie just really has um I think the push and pull more of she's finding success as an actress. She's got this astronaut boyfriend, it all and soon to be fiance. Like all of that stuff feels like it's all kind of coming together for MJ in a way that in the first movie she's really struggling. And I think that the sort of uncertainty of success and the uncertainty of a life that she thinks she wants, I find a little bit more interesting than what she's grappling with in the first one, which is more like teenage problems.
So, speaking of who knows who is Spider-Man and who knows who is not Spider-Man, I want to talk about one element of the movie that has bothered me from the moment I saw it, and still kind of bothers me. And this will lead us into the train sequence, which is how often in the final half hour of this movie Peter Parker takes off his mask. So often, and there's never a reason. There's hardly ever like any good reason beyond just, I don't know what the reason is, beyond just people.
The reason is people need to see his
People need to see
face.
his face. I mean, in the train sequence, you need to have them saying he's just a kid, and you need to have Mary Jane and Octavius seeing who he is. But there's really no other narrative reason for it. I'm not minding it because of where it leads, but it is kind of like, what?
Well, it's interesting because in the train sequence, there is some sort of a fire situation. Like his mask catches on fire a little bit. I'm not disagreeing with you, but
Yeah.
What's weird about it is like he's been shot, he's been set on fire many times, and he's never had to take off the mask before. But this time he's like, oh, I mean, so it's a little ridiculous, but yeah. But the train sequence is, I would imagine, if you were to like take a poll like on the street of the sequence they remember most from all of the Spider-Man movies, this is probably the one.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about this question because him taking off his mask bothers me in the abstract, and yet every single moment when it happens, I'm not bugged. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Like I think it's something about it, is that thing of like everything in this movie shouldn't work and everything in this movie does work. And, it's always motivated in a way that feels necessary. It's just that they're all bunched together. If
Sure.
somehow they'd found a way to like do one of them in the first act, I don't know how that would have possibly worked. But like that, then I think I would feel less, but it's like 30 minutes and he takes his mask off for like 50 different people.
I will say this is kind of a superhero movie cliche, like more so than in the comic books where people's secret identity is protected more. I guess it's because they want to have the main actor they've hired be on screen more often. But in so many superhero movies, they tell so many people who they are very early on. Like by the time the second movie rolls around, almost everybody knows because I don't know. Anyway,
And I think partially, to some degree, Iron Man is to blame. Iron Man ends with "I am Iron Man."
yeah.
And once they realize that audiences will roll with that and that they don't actually need the duality as a crux or crutch, then kind of all bets are off a little bit. I would argue that it removes a significant amount of conflict. But it's kind of, I don't know.
I think like yeah, I mean I get why the MCU does it the way they do, and I think it works. And also like it's not that untrue to the comics in many cases, but it's very much like yeah, there is something really compelling about a secret identity and people being let
Yeah.
in on that secret. There's always something compelling about a secret the audience is in on with the protagonists, and then how the other characters slowly find that out. At the same time, when the secret is just sort of dangling out there, and we may talk about this later with the book about a TV show called Lost, people can get tired of that secret just dangling out there. So, like, I do think you have to manage sort of bringing people into the fold. Now, this movie does a lot of it, but it is all with an eye toward future developments in the story. And like it's one way in which I think this movie improves on Superman 2 is that movie ends with Clark erasing Lois's memory, which is not a thing that Peter Parker is capable of, not being from Krypton. But this movie ends with him being like, yeah, I can't be with you. You have to forget this. You have to not remember me. And she's like, no, I choose this. I choose you. I think it's a profound moment. But every other superhero movie that's done a version of that has erased the girl's memory and
Well,
just been like, it really removes her like,
or just gets rid of the character. Because like
Yeah.
Vicky Vale finds out at the end of the first Batman, but then she's no longer to be seen. And he does.
She signed an NDA though, so it's fine.
Yeah, it's still be fun. I mean, I do think that it is interesting because end of Batman Returns, he tears off his mask for Selena Kyle, who now knows, obviously. But again, we never see her again, so I guess we don't have to worry about that. But that's the last time, because Batman from that point on is never revealed, or the whole Bruce Wayne component is just never revealed, which I think is probably a good thing. I think it diffuses something by getting rid of it.
Doesn't he
except in the case of this film, which I think
doesn't he tell Anne Hathaway in Dark Knight Rises, or she just figures it out or something like that?
I think she just like they're together at the end. So
I feel like he just always tells Catwoman. He's just like, you're the one person who gets me.
Yeah.
You get me. Yeah. I the train sequence is phenomenal for a bunch of reasons. First of all, it's a tremendous action sequence.
Yeah.
It's just amazingly well done. And then there is the self-sacrifice of it all. And the Christ pose, I guess, definitely plays into that.
The Parker.
Which, by the way, we'll be covering next week on this podcast. So we will get your thoughts at the end of this episode on the Passion of the Christ. But I do think that, it's the self-sacrifice, but then it's him being carried over the crowd. He's just a kid. I think in a way, Emily, it's the stronger version of the 9/11 added sequence in the first film of the don't fuck with New York, you fuck with New York, you fuck with all of us sort of thing,
This movie is very much a post 9/11 movie in a way that the first one just couldn't be. Like, obviously the first one was released in that environment and was read as that, but this movie's very much about like ordinary heroism, about people who do great things without much reward, and about just like a thing I love about Raimi's Spider-Man movies is they are very much about the idea that all of us are capable of heroism and we don't necessarily need superpowers to do that. The people on the train are capable of heroism, and they, they stand in the way between Doc Ock and Spider-Man. That doesn't mean that they aren't like rudely shoved aside, but like I think that too often superhero movies sort of, especially now, sort of turn just ordinary citizens into people that are just kind of bystanders for the big important events. And these movies are always like, no, the people in this world are trying to do good, even if they don't have the powers of a radioactive spider.
And I think also,
I absolutely agree.
I mentioned kind of the surprising little arc of this film that I think, is paid off by the choice that MGA makes at the end of saying, no, I want to do this. I want to be part of this. Um, that whole sequence in the train is kind of the same idea. The whole movie is sort of about how nobody can understand what it's like to be Peter Parker and Spider-Man. Everyone is judging the choices he makes as Peter Parker because they don't know that he's Spider-Man. And, how is he ever going to reconcile this? He's a man alone. And the whole point of the end of the film, I think, is he's not a man alone. That there are lots of people in his life, both ordinary New Yorkers and people he knows personally, who are in his corner, whether they know why they're in his corner or not, or what he's doing or not. And so that to me is what's so moving about the way it plays out, not just because it gives MJ her own agency, in this story, but also because it pays off this idea that he doesn't have to be alone, that there are other people out there that can carry some of this load for him.
Yeah.
I fully agree, and to piggyback on it, I know that Spider-Man takes place in a real place, right? It takes place in New York, unlike a lot of comic books that don't. But you never feel the population of the city. You never feel the inhabitants of the city in basically every comic book movie. I think Gotham looks great, looks cool, right? But like the people of Gotham don't mean anything to me. Metropolis is the same thing. As much as I actually watched the first Superman for the first time this weekend. I had seen it in bits and pieces over the years, and I quite liked it. And I think that movie is definitely the closest to me caring about the inhabitants of Metropolis. But this movie and the first Spider-Man, it's clear that Raimi wants people to actually associate with the people on the ground of these movies. And I think that that's like, and forgive this, but like it's kind of the superpower of these movies. Like I really do think that by feeling like there's real people that inhabit this world, you really want there to be a hero swinging through the buildings coming to their aid in a way that you just don't with most comic book movies. I mean, where does Iron Man take place? LA?
Iron Man
Malibu?
Iron Man, like I think takes place in
San Diego, maybe.
Yeah, but also the Middle East, but not really the Middle East. Like just kind of,
and then like the third one's some small town
in like Kentucky. Yeah, like
it's just very strange.
It is wild to me how like obviously I've mostly read Superman comics, but so many of them just feel like they take place in a city where there's people having lives. And like some of the most famous Superman sequences that you'll see passed around on social media are like him just helping somebody with a minor everyday problem. And I love the thing I think that Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 1 to some extent gets right is a lot of it is just I'm helping people with an everyday problem. I'm helping in a purse snatching, or I'm like telling kids, don't play in the street, which I think is in the first one. And like it's it really captures that vibe in a way that no other superhero movies have quite managed to my mind.
Totally.
I'm just gonna make a small chamber drama about Superman, just like helping people with their marriages.
Yeah. As we wrap this up, I do want to bring up Ursula and the movie that I wish we got where Ursula and Peter Parker end up together. I do think, I mean, obviously I'm kidding.
Yeah.
But I do feel like there's something, I don't even mean that there's something between Peter and Ursula. I mean, there sort of is, but I kind of just sort of I really love the scene where she offers him a slice of chocolate cake and a glass of milk.
Yeah.
And it is just, it's when he's at his lowest and it feels like he's sort of at his lowest, and he just is embracing the fact that someone cares about him. It's just a really lovely thing, and they don't. I guess what I'm getting at is I love that it's in the movie, and that it would never ever be in the movie today. It's just a nice little scene, and that actress is so winning and so lovely. And yeah, she's just like, she's clearly in love with Peter from afar, from across the hall. And it's just, I don't know. I think that there's something really, really sweet about it.
These movies don't have a ton of parts for women, which is, a thing. Like, it's mostly May and MJ. But I do love, again, it's that thing of like when there's a minor character, sometimes taken from the comics, sometimes not. It's like, I'm going to put this really interesting character actress in the part. If it's Emily Deschanel, if it's Elizabeth Banks, if it's any number of other Joy Bryant in a one-line role, it just is like, yeah, it really finds interesting faces for us to look at and interesting people for him to have like warm interactions with. And I appreciate that about its use of women, even if I don't think it's like, does it pass the Bechdel test? Probably not. I think MJ and May talk about her play. So like, I think it does actually.
I mean, it's just, I think that, yeah, I don't know. I think that the beta-ness of Peter to some degree does sort of create a situation where it doesn't feel as sort of totally within gender roles, if you know what I'm saying. Like, I think that Peter is a little bit outside the norm in that respect.
It's the virgin Peter Parker versus the Chad Spider-Man. Like, we all know that's true.
That's Spider-Man 3's story, I think, actually.
Yeah, it is very much like, I love when a superhero movie can pull that off of like, yeah, this guy's such a nerd that nobody ever imagines.
Yeah.
But yes, it's that scene is lovely, the scene with the cake, and I think that in another world they would be a wonderful couple. But you're coming for Mary Jane Watson over my dead hands. Over my dead hands. What?
So I have a question. You mentioned this a little earlier, Emily, on the Peter Harry stuff, and I would actually say that it doesn't totally land for me. The potential of it at the end of the last film, of what could transpire between these two, never is really fully executed. I mean, even in the moment when it's revealed that Peter is Spider-Man, Peter essentially says to Harry, "We don't have time for this. There's bigger shit at play.
Right.
Time to move on." Which is, they kind of yada the conflict.
It works though. Because
I'm not saying it doesn't work. I'm saying it's just not what it could
because they both care about MJ. They get away with it,
Right.
Like,
right.
There's an implicit love triangle there that the third film makes more explicit. The first one has it in there as well, but the third film is like, what if we made this a very explicit, and it doesn't quite work. But it is like, I do think it fuels that moment when Peter's like, I got to get out of here. We'll talk about this later. Let's attend couples counseling together, Harry.
It does feel a little bit like, it feels a little bit like the yada it, because they're like, we'll deal with this in the next movie. And I think for Harry as an arc and as a storyline in this movie, that kind of does him a little disjustice. You know what I mean? It just, you're sort of like, this doesn't feel like we really pay this off. Harry is kind of just punted through this movie until the third movie, and then he dies. Yeah, it just, whatever. I love the Octavius being like, Peter Parker, brilliant but lazy, is great. As not to belabor this point, but Kirsten's reaction to seeing Peter's face in the Spider-Man costume is, no dialogue, just her face, and it's all there. Everything she's feeling, everything that she's ever thought about this guy, it's all right there, and it's masterful.
I love that the climax of this film, the action climax is the train. The story climax of this is two guys realizing they have to give up on their dreams, and then one of them pushes the sun into a river. It's
yeah, it's perfect.
Yep.
And obviously we mentioned earlier the allusions to The Graduate, her running in the wedding dress, running from her wedding. Um, you have the great Jonah line, make sure that they're not open
No caviar.
Open the caviar.
Yeah.
Your husband is great in this movie, Emily.
Every scene with him feels like it's in a different movie from the movie we're watching, and yet it still works because you're just like, oh, of course this guy exists in this universe.
Yeah, like the fact that he has pinned Spider-Man's costume to his wall of his office, and then when it's stolen,
like a trophy. It's so good.
It's crazy. He's great in this. He's always great.
Everybody's great. Everybody's great. Even James Franco handled the worst stuff in the movie. Pretty good. Pretty good.
Yeah, he's all right. The Mary Jane saying "Go get him, Tiger."
Yes. Oh my God.
Is the fucking best.
Yeah.
Like, what else do you need? And obviously we've mentioned it a few times at this point, but the look on her face, the final shot of this movie, you are leaving your audience not in happiness, not in like possibility. You're leaving it on the face of an unsure individual. That's bold.
Yeah, especially given that when I think back about watching both the first movie and this movie for the first time, as somebody who had read comic books for most of my life, back to my single-digit years, who watched Spider-Man, on TV when I was a kid, both in live action and animation, and this is very important, played the Atari 2600 Spider-Man video game as a kid, where the great appeal of playing a Spider-Man game wasn't a great game. But you swung back and forth as you gradually went up a building, and you tried to avoid the Green Goblin's sky sled from slashing your web. But you got to have the fun of shooting a little web up high on a building, swinging up and getting higher and higher. And that, as an 8-9-year-old, whenever I was playing that game on Atari, that was the fun. It was just swinging. And
just satisfying.
Spider-Man and Spider-Man 2 both really got that whole idea of how much fun would it be just to swing through a city, just to flip, and move on through. And so they give you that rush. They give you I don't recall exactly. You guys have seen it more recently than I have, but they give you the rush of at the end of Spider-Man, I think, of you get to see him swinging through the city as it ends. Here you get that rush, and then boom, cut to MJ.
Right. Well, because all of the Spider-Man movies, for the most part, end with what you're talking about. A money shot of him swinging through the, and then like right into camera and then credits. Not this one. This one's like, the third one certainly doesn't.
Neither does 3. It ends with a bunch of people being like,
it's like dinner theater or something. It's absolutely insane. But generally speaking, to your point, Noel, like it does try to end on the like, it would be awesome to be Spider-Man credits.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely is like, I love that choice of being like the two sides of this coin are, he finally has everything he wants, but also he finally has everything he wants. Like now, this woman can be taken from him at any time, and she's aware of that, and he's aware of that, and also, gotta go be Spider-Man. Bye, go get him, Tiger.
Yeah. That's great. So we rate these films at the end of our podcast, from 0 to 99, 0 being the lowest, 99 obviously being the highest. In 2004, I probably would have given this film like a 72. I liked it. I didn't love it. Again, like I said, I liked it fine. It didn't knock my socks off. Now I'm at like a 94. I think it's an amazing, wonderful movie that I watch quite frequently. Noel, what about you?
Well, I just ranked it on Letterboxd, which I'd never done before. After I watched it last night, and I give it 4.5 stars. So you could just, if you want to do a direct
extrapolate, that
would be a 90. Yeah, sure. So let's stay 90.
That sounds right. Emily, what about you?
Oh, sorry, you cut out for a second, so I thought maybe you disappeared.
No.
I in 2004 probably would have given this like a 91. I would have been. It was. I didn't think it was like a perfect film, but I really loved it. And I definitely really love. I do think it's a perfect third act in many ways. I have watched it several times over the years since. It grows in my estimation every time I watch it. I wrote a little thing on Letterboxd about how I think the best movies make you nostalgic for them as you're watching them and the moment that you're watching them. Like I'm already nostalgic for watching this movie again last night. And I think that's a trick that this movie pulls that none of the other Spider-Man movies do, even as much as I like the Raimi ones. Yeah, this is rapidly like crawling up my list of favorite films of all time. So I'm gonna give it like a 97. I think this
Okay.
Love
movie's
it. Love it.
I think this movie's pretty unimpeachable, except for occasionally James Franco's like, I'm gonna get Spider-Man, and it never quite gets
Never
there.
fully gets there. Um, there is a an actor in this film, Daniel Day Kim,
Yes.
who
Yeah.
was
Had a
was
pretty
in a
good
little show.
2004. Yeah.
Yeah.
He was in a little show called Lost. Would you guys like to talk about your book?
Yes, we would.
Yes.
What do you want to know? Ask any questions you like.
Yeah, we've written a book called Back to the Island. It's a complete critical companion to Lost. We've reviewed every episode, some in like longer essays, some in like smaller capsule essays, because who really needs my thoughts on,
Everyone needs your thoughts on everything, Emily.
what's one of the episode where they're all just kind of riding around on the raft after
Sure.
the raft attack? You don't need like long thoughts on that from me. I can write you a solid 3 paragraphs and you're out. But we've also written some further essays that dig into other aspects of the show, from more socio-political ones like its treatment of race and gender, to just like Noel, did you play the Lost video game, or did you just like check out
I did.
images of it or
Yeah, I
something?
did not play it, but I read some articles about it, and I found some good academic research on sort of the metafictional Lost stuff, the novels, the video games, the other those kind of things. I wrote an essay about that. I wrote an essay about spoiler culture, how the people who wanted to find out what was happening on Lost before it actually aired, and then I wrote kind of a grand attempt to summarize what I feel like the main concept and theme of Lost is. So no
I
spoilers
have a
on that one.
question for you guys, though.
Yeah.
What is an episode that you love but is not loved? Like, do you have a hot take episode?
I
Do you
think,
have an episode
Emily's got a big one, I think, that she can fire away on.
I have several. I love expose. A lot of people hate expose. I don't know that that's that controversial of an opinion. It's definitely become a love or hate episode. I love Trisha Tanaka is dead, which I've learned a lot of people think is terrible. But they're wrong about that. The episode that is definitely most Lost fans don't like, but I do like a little bit, is Dave from season 2, which is Hurley has an imaginary best friend named Dave, played by Evan Handler. And I think a lot of people think that episode is a bad twist, a sort of Shyamalan-esque bad twist. I think that it is a sort of really interesting exploration of mental health that maybe doesn't always stick the landing, but I do really like that episode. Noel, I just want to hear your thoughts on Across the Sea from.
Yeah, absolutely. I was hoping you would set me up for that. Really, multiple episodes in season 6 that I think are season 6 I think is a understandably maligned, but I do think that the actual by the time they were making season 6, the people who made Lost knew how to make Lost, and I think those episodes are very, very strong in and of themselves. I love Recon. I love Dr. Linus. Those are 2 that I wrote about in the book. But yeah, Across the Sea, which at the time that it aired, I think I was one of the few critics who was like defending it. I even went on podcasts back then where I was like, no. I mean, it's tricky when you're doing this kind of deep mythology stuff. I think I've been covering The Acolyte for Vulture, and I think they're struggling with that. How do you do big mythology, origin stories of everything, and where the main characters are kids? Which is the problem with like the first half of Across the Sea. It's basically 2 little kids who are kind of carrying the load of the story of the island, and everyone's speaking in very kind of weirdly elevated language, and it's awkward. I get it, but I think that it strengthens as it goes, and I think it does have sort of a, I don't know, there's a going for it element that I really enjoy. It's the this is what it is, and also I think there's also sort of a band-aid ripping off element of we got to get through this so that we can get to the big emotional climax of the series, which is what I think Lindelof and Hughes really cared about more. than the mythology, but they had to give the fans some mythology. So like, here it is with 3 episodes to go, or 2 episodes to go, if you don't count the finale as 2 episodes. Here it is, and this is what it's all about. And now let's get to find out who ends up with who in the end, and in the big mystical church.
I think that because we talked, Noel and I talked a little bit about this before we got on mic, about across the sea, a divisive episode to say the least.
Which by the way, my essay for that is called "The Secret of Glowy Cave." So yeah.
Well, that was going to be my point. I think my issue with that episode has less to do with, I mean, first of all, like tonally, it's just odd. It's just oddly executed. It feels just, it's a weird episode. Yes. But on top of it being a weird episode, I think the thing that bumped me and seemed to bump a lot of people at the time was Glowy Cave answers all your questions. we created a real big bucket, and if you have any questions about numbers or polar bears, the Glowy Cave is the answer. It's like, I don't know that totally works.
A thing that I found interesting watching the show is how many of the questions the show answered. It just did not answer them in the way that people were accustomed to, where someone sits down and tells you the answer. I wrote an essay for the season 5 episode, the Jeremy Bentham, I forget the rest of the title. It's about John Locke off the island. And it's that episode essentially answers the polar bear question, which is still the thing that people are like always complaining about not knowing the answer to, because it comes up in the pilot. So it's why, they sort of fixate on that. But it has answered it across multiple episodes of television from season 3 through season 5. You have to really be paying attention. But if you do, you get the complete answers to why polar bears were there, what they were doing there, how they functioned within the island. Sure. But yeah, a lot of people wanted someone to sit down in season 6 and just be like, okay, you got any questions for me? I'll answer them. Like Jacob just sits down and does the rundown. Right. And that would have been dramatically inert. But I do think that there was a certain part of the audience that just wanted that.
Well, I think that, yes to what you're saying. I think it's also emblematic of a real kind of fork in the road television wise, right? Because, if you go farther back to like Twin Peaks, for instance, and ABC assuming that people needed to know who killed Laura Palmer, that it was a necessity, literally like probably less than 22 episodes into that show, they're like, we need to know, which is an insane thing to do. Like, and obviously killed the show, for lack of a better way of putting it. And I do think that Lost and Lindelof as a writer is always trying to exist in this kind of purgatory, no pun intended, of answers but no answers, right? Like wants to give you kind of both. And I think that is tough. I think that it creates kind of a neither fish nor fowl situation. I like what he did, but
the absolute pinnacle of that is the Leftovers finale, where he's like tells you what happened and then is like, but I'm going to give you no proof of this, so you can choose to believe it or not. And like, again, I love that, but also the Leftovers was not a very big hit, as influential as that show has been.
The Leftovers is such an interesting reaction against Lost in so many ways. And I think is brilliant as well in a completely different way. Yeah. But I do think that Lost, it just went up on Netflix, or back on Netflix. I think it was on Netflix and then got pulled. Yeah. So it's back on Netflix. So now you have a whole bunch of think pieces again, and apparently a whole new generation is deciding to watch Lost.
Great for them. They're going to have a good time.
And they should read the book.
Yeah. Please order the book. It should be out as this episode drops. It's available anywhere you get books. I always recommend bookshop.org because it helps independent bookstores. But if you want to order it from any other site, I'm going to be happy about that. And if you see me outside and you have your book along, I will sign it and I'll give you a high five. That is a St. James
Emily guarantee.
Yeah.
So next week on this podcast, the 10th movie on our top 10 of the domestic box office of the 2000s is The Passion of the Christ. Made a boatload of money. Noel, did you see The Passion of the Christ?
I did. I saw it here where I live in Arkansas, which was an interesting experience. Crowded theater full of evangelicals who had been told by their pastors to go see this movie. I remember my wife's father and mother are both Southern Baptists, and This is not really the kind of thing they would ordinarily go to see, R-rated in a foreign language, but they felt like they had to for the cultural moment to go to see it. And I'll never forget, Donna's poor mom just kind of like trying to figure out how she could wrestle with this thing that was obviously very important to see, but what she clearly found very unpleasant. It was just not a fun 2.5 hours for her.
Unpleasant experience.
Yeah. Somewhere in the depths of the internet, I wrote an article about Mel Gibson as a director, with the understanding of Mel Gibson as a person being problematic, but how he is as a filmmaker, including Passion of the Christ and Apocalyptic, which is a movie I think is actually very good. So I don't know if it's still out there somewhere. It was written for the blog related to the movie distribution company Oscilloscope. So if you Google Noel Murray, Mel Gibson, hopefully you won't see anything too dicey. But yeah,
I'm doing it right now.
I do think that, like, as we talk about on our episode, it's
there it is.
There it is. All right. The movie's such a cultural flashpoint, and was obviously enormously successful at the box office, but and spawned kind of a whole genre unto itself. None of which were ever as successful as this film, but still successful in their own right. I do think it's quite interesting to sort of also think about it. And I don't want us to do this with all the films that we're talking about in this decade, but it is interesting to think of it as a post 9/11 film, and people that did sort of look towards religion for comfort in a time that was, very nerve-wracking and emotionally unstable. So I think there is something there too. It's hitting a lot of buttons for people.
Yeah, but we talk about it with Eve Ettinger and Kieran Darkwater of the Kitchen Table Cult podcast, so we get into Christian nationalism and all kinds of fun stuff.
It's a great episode. I had a blast.
It was wonderful. Yeah.
I mean, I know that obviously it's a fraught subject matter, but it's a fun episode. I mean, as a Jewish person from Canada, I was bringing a very different perspective to it, but I also didn't know what to expect of the episode. And I do think that, like, it's a much more fun episode than I expected it to be. So for what that's worth, but yeah, Noel, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us about
great time. Thanks for giving me an excuse to watch this movie again.
Oh my God, of course. And to our listeners, please remember to rate, review, subscribe, and subscribe to our Patreon, where I'm talking about the films of the 1990s with various guests, and it's fun, and you'll love it, and just do that for us. That'd be great.
It's good. And buy Back to the Islands on all websites. All websites are selling it now. I'm hearing. I have news in.
They all have
websites.
Yeah, there you go.
All right.
Thank you again, Noel.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Talk to you later. Bye.